Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Louise Bernikow is a journalist, a best-selling author, a used-to-be academic, and an activist historian who encourages us to learn from the past and to work for the future. And I'm very glad that you're my guest today.
Thank you. I'm glad that I'm your guest today, too.
Good. We have a lot to talk about, and I didn't quite know how to organize our conversation, but I think we should start with your books.
Fine.
You've written 7 books.
Right.
The most recent ones are these 2. This was the first, Bark If You Love Me, which is a great title, and then Dreaming in Libro.
With a subtitle that says, How a Good Dog Tamed a Bad Woman.
Right.
That's important.
So tell us.
Well, first, I almost feel apologetic, so I'll start with that.
Yeah.
Here I am on CUNY TV, and I'm remembering my father saying to me after I'd done 6 feminist history-related books, saying to me, "You're writing about what? A dog?" You know, and so first I feel I have to defend it and say that this rash of dog literature that's out there, see, I'm very much part of the curve, not ahead of it. These books are about people's lives, I want to say. And so it is about the dog, and the dog was a very important spirit in my life and character in my life. But I found a secret way, not so secret way, to write about my own life.
Right, it's a memoir, basically.
Yes,
right.
yes.
Now, is a memoir just a period in time? We used to have autobiographies. We don't have those anymore.
Well,
what's the difference?
For me, it's a period in time with the kind of backstory, history that I have. That I'm a woman who grew up in what we do or don't call second wave feminism, and I'm living single, without a husband, without children in New York City. And I think that kind of life is something I didn't see a lot in the literature about. So that's kind of the background for this beautiful brown creature who followed me home from Riverside Park. I'm not a person who grew up with animals. My mother said they were dirty, and she told me I was allergic to them, but that was a lie.
That was good.
So I was totally unprepared for this event that descended upon my life, namely that this little guy, he was then about 1, picked me. He picked me.
He was abandoned, and you saw him in the back of a police car?
Right, and he was
Looked
in
at you with those
Riverside
big
Park
eyes?
on the Upper West Side. And he decided to come home with me, and he totally changed my life. I mean, a good dog tamed a bad woman. You know, we're so used to hearing about how we domesticate the animals, but between you and me,
He did that to you?
he domesticated me.
Well,
And that's what I mean.
Well, they're delightful books, and I, of course, cried at the end of Dreaming in Libro when you talked about how he just went over to his bed and died after being ill. And he was older, though. He was 9 years old.
He was a little more than 9. That's young.
Yeah, but it was very sad. But what struck me also, which is interesting, is that a couple of years, not a couple, some years ago, you wrote a book about loneliness. You traveled across the country about loneliness. And then you
now I fixed it.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
I did. You know, since I'm always thinking about history, part of what was in my imagination was the witches, believe it, the witches and their animal familiars, you know. I don't have a gender theory about dogs, but I do see something very special about women and animals. Not that we're, you know, as some ecofeminists believe, that we're more attuned to the animal life. I'm not sure of that. But in terms of living a life without feeling lonely, I didn't feel very lonely before he came, but he really provided a presence that was staggering to me.
It's the kind of
I
thing,
wasn't prepared for it.
It's the kind of thing you feel when you have a child.
Right.
It's a whole extra dimension in life that you don't know you're missing when you don't have it.
Right.
But it opens up these vistas.
Exactly. Whole areas of life. But the difference between this and a child, because I did a lot of talking about this, and many people said, oh, the dog is your baby.
But he was your companion.
I kept saying we're like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or Thelma and Louise, or something, because there was more reciprocity, I think, between him and me than there is between a mommy and a baby.
Except when the baby grows.
Right.
Which they do.
Right.
And then, I mean, I consider my best friends my 2 daughters.
Right. But it was that business about being taken care of, though. that was it. One of my very strong feelings was that I was being taken care of as much as I was caring for this creature.
So interesting. So when you wrote your book about loneliness, did you find any women who had animals?
I don't think I was looking.
Yeah.
It came from a piece I did in the Times where I had been looking at really social organization. It was at the time when ATM machines first came in, and there were a whole slew of technological developments in life that made it possible to never interact with another human being. And that was the premise. And I went out to find ways people were countering that. My favorite one was the Senior Citizens Orchestra of Miami Beach, which is a big section of that book, you know, where people really companioned each other and found ways. I think I've always been, you know, looking for ways in which the standard story is more nuanced than what we're told. I mean, that's my politics.
But you're also, that's your train. I mean, you are an academic essentially, right?
Right.
With
I'm an intellectual.
An intellectual.
That's
I'm so glad I've met an intellectual, because I never know what is an intellectual.
I think an intellectual is somebody who gets a lot of, you know that I have spent 3 days hunting down who were the women in the anti-war movement.
The recent in the late 60s,
in the Vietnam for a column I write on Women's E-News about women's history. I think an intellectual is somebody who gets excited about ideas.
So do you think I'm an intellectual?
Yeah, but you're also very active in the world.
Pragmatic.
But I, at heart, my favorite thing to do is to read and write.
That's interesting, right?
That's probably an intellectual.
That's right. It's a more individual, isolated kind of thing. So let's talk about finding women who had leadership roles or what they did in the anti-war movement. It's especially interesting because you've written the American Women's Almanac,
right?
Which is a great, irreverent, as they say, collection of people, of stories about what they did, of things they've said, and of pictures of how they were doing it.
It's a popular book.
It's a great book.
Let me say that I keep thinking about my dad a lot. You know, one of the best things who died just before 9/11, and so this is the time of year I think of him. But he said, you write about these things in a way that even I can understand them, which I considered a great compliment, and some kind of daddy echo of Virginia Woolf's The Common Reader.
Right.
You know, because I got really interested in our feminist history, in the history of people who made a difference for women. And I wanted to invigorate it. That's really what I wanted to do. It's not that I'm a scholar who discovered, although I have been, but I didn't set out to discover more about women and the American past. I set out to find a way to communicate it to people who thought they didn't care or thought they knew all about it or something like that. And so, and also to connect it to now.
So in the history, in this book, do you have a favorite time, or do you have any favorite women?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm still in love with the standards, you know, with Stanton and Anthony, and I do have a favorite named Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who that was a sense of discovery, to learn that there were 3, not 2, that Matilda Gage was part of that group of 19th century women in upstate New York, where I think there's something in the water.
Seneca Falls,
yeah,
right?
Something in the water. Harriet Tubman's house was there, you know, all of upstate New York.
That's not where we met.
We did.
Is that right?
We met in upstate New York, but not at Seneca Falls.
Okay.
You and I met. All right.
We're going to diverge.
We'll diverge for a minute, but it's about being a feminist in the late 60s and 70s, and what fed what we knew, and what inspired us, and those 19th century women were part of it, but so were what was going on in our own lives. You and I met in 1970 in Albany, when the New York State Legislature was debating abortion. and in fact came out on the side of one of the early, New York and California.
Very early, right.
Liberalized was the word,
Right.
the abortion laws. And you gave me a ride home from Albany.
Oh, good.
That's
for
where I
me.
met you.
And I was working for John Lindsay then.
That's right. But what was really important about that moment for me, in addition to that I met you, and I've known you now for all the years since then, and followed you around in being sort of inside. You were working for Lindsay, and at the time, the conflict for me between creating change by working within government or outside it was very intense, because I'd run the Upper West Side for Gene McCarthy.
And I supported Robert Kennedy.
That's right. But so that was important for me to know somebody who had made a different choice, because I was beginning then to think that working within the system wasn't going to do anything, and the thing to do was to take it to the streets. But the other reason that is a pivotal moment, at least in my political development, is that in Albany, do you remember this? That we were there to support the change in the law, to actually wanted to abolish abortion laws, but were willing to settle for more liberal laws, and there was opposition. And that's the first time I ever saw the opposition. And in those days of the hearings, do you remember this? Busloads of people pulled up and in yellow school buses, and they started to come off the buses, and they were women. They were women on those buses who were opposed to any change, who wanted abortion to still be a crime. And that is the first time that I saw many things. I mean, this was crucial to me. I'll never forget it. First of all, that they were women, when there was a rhetoric about sisterhood, right? But we're women and they're women, so what do we make of that? That they were being directed by men, because you could see the men, directing these women, and that they were forceful. They blocked the elevators. That's what I remember about that day. We were trying to get to the hearing room, and they had figured out how to sabotage the elevators. So it showed me that a certain, probably class contempt that I had for the opposition, for the antis, because my friends and I thought we were, smart and right and educated, and suddenly here were these troops, this army of women who were not like us and who were better organized than we were. And it's the first time I understood that the opposition was serious, and that we should take them seriously, which I had never thought before.
Right. It's interesting. I have my own story about the abortion, because we did Howard Moody had the network of abortion, a referral network, and he knew all the people. A cleric, a minister from Judson Memorial Church down in the Village. And he had people that he referred to if you needed an abortion, didn't want to travel someplace. And he had this intricate network. So when we thought the law was going to be passed, I had the people from the Health and Hospital Corporation, the city hospitals, and Howard sit down together, and he really helped them draft the city's plan on how they were going to do this abortion thing. But more than that, just before that, when Lindsay was a strong supporter of this abortion reform stuff, and we drafted a statement for him to say in Albany. And we were at a meeting, and one of my fellow staff members, a young man, hotshot young man, I'll never forget him, but I won't tell you who it is, he looked at the statement and he said, well, I think we'd better run it past Dick Brown, who at the time was the counsel to the mayor up in Albany. And I looked at him and he said, well, after all, you're a woman, so you're biased. And that was how many years ago? I don't know.
30,
I've never forgotten.
40.
So every time I see or hear his name, that's
Right.
it. Anyway.
Right. Well,
so that's an interesting kind of thing. But you're always, now you've been very political.
Oh, I have. I mean, I was political then, but different kinds of political, like many of us. But another thing to come back to, the connection, the reason I think we have to learn lessons from the past and apply them now, not just honor and valorize all the wonderful things that women have done to create social change, but actually analyze and understand them. One of the things I say, I have a program about called The Shoulders We Stand On, Women as Agents of Change, in which I take the history and have really exciting pictures and talk about what it means to me, which means somebody who lived through her own revolutionary time. And one of the most important things is this business about laws. You know, that we learned in civics class in school that if you want to create change, you have to get the laws changed. And I think you worked a lot on things like that, more than I did. And I think, and I say, that getting a law changed is not the end of activism, it's the beginning. In our history, it's the beginning, because once, abortion is a perfect example, once the law was changed about abortion, a lot of people said, well, now we've done it, you know, goodbye, I'll work on something else. That's when the organizing really had to begin, because as you well know, not only did the law get whittled away, but applying the law on the ground
It's a whole different story.
was a different story. And that
still
there
is.
had to be a lot of consciousness raising and organizing about the fact that huge parts of this country didn't have an abortion provider. And if they did, the abortion provider was in danger. And that's also part of understanding the force that we were up against.
But, you know, it's interesting because you're saying we should learn from the past. Now, look at us. I mean, I'm older than you, but we're not part of the 20 crowd anymore, 20-year-olds. And I find increasingly you have to fight off that feeling of being irrelevant.
Right.
And that bothers me. I mean, I'm still a good political thinker and a good active politician.
Right.
But
well, you know,
it's such an interesting thing, and it is. And we've got a world peopled with people who don't know the past at all. Not only feminist history, they don't know anything.
Right.
It's so interesting.
But there's another part of it that's about how we
And as we get older, we're going to have a problem, right?
About how we talk to them.
About what it used to be, the olden days.
Right. I was the keynote speaker at a National Women's Studies conference where I represented, you know, it was about generations. So I represented my generation, which is the 60s and the so-called second wave. And there were a lot of young 20-something women there who were in a group called Riot Girl. And I had begun by describing a Riot Girl meeting I went to where they totally misunderstood what consciousness raising was. And I was confronted by young women who felt that in talking about that, I was putting them down, that I was disparaging their political process. And I learned from that. And I started looking around at myself and my peers and all that, and how we talk about what we know. And there is a certain amount of mom, you know, that we become mom. We say, I know better, let me tell you, and all that stuff. And I've made a very concerted effort myself. I don't want to be mom. I've spent my life trying not to be mom.
I like to change everything. So what you know, the knowledge you have, you want to put it into it to develop new things, new ways of thinking.
But as we've learned in politics, part of our job is to listen. Not to wave a finger and to listen and to be not only continually politically active, but resources.
It's also to talk up. There's too much listening around, I think, in the world today.
And share the power.
A little courage. Don't you think we need a little courage?
We need a lot of courage. We need a lot of courage, but that's why Grannies for Peace.
It's wonderful.
It is easier to talk up when you have, quote, less to lose, in that you're not about to lose your job.
But Grannies for Peace met on Fifth Avenue, and they were dressed in black. It started at 8:30 in the morning when Bush was going to speak at the UN. And they brought umbrellas.
As he's doing today.
I just was making it more generic, but that's all right. Okay. You can do it. It was today they did it. And they dressed in black, and they had umbrellas, and they did that Louisiana, New Orleans kind of thing with their black umbrellas, and they walked to the UN. And they're in their 80s. There's some in a wheelchair. They're walking. I was at Times Square when they arrested them, and they put the woman in the wheelchair into the police wagon. It was just ridiculous. Anyway, let's talk about your local. You're obviously also a very strong advocate, right?
Yes.
For other issues, not just feminism, peace and justice. And what I found really interesting about this book is your effort to include other than white women, which is such an important thing. Let's talk about that.
It's like breathing. It's hard to even think what there is to say about it. Part of this is what I grew up with. When I was...
Where did you grow up?
I don't mean in my family. I grew up in New York, but I
mean
mean in
from?
feminism.
No.
I came from Queens. My father owned a candy store.
Oh, good.
It's a good, solid working class credentials. But I went to Barnard and I went to Columbia. And when feminism hit me, which was all local, talk about local. Someday I hope someone writes a social history of feminism, because my life was all about living on the Upper West Side and running into Adrienne Rich, who said, we're going to have a little poetry reading next Thursday. Yeah. And so, as important as media communications are, the business of who your neighbors are and who you know and what they're doing was really important in my life. And all the women I knew in the late 60s and early 70s who were creating a feminist literature, if nothing, as part of a feminist movement, they were just... My favorite person was Muriel Rukeyser. My favorite line was Muriel's line, "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open." And I think that was the enterprise of a lot of writers and people who didn't go on to be writers, but who had something to say. And that was not all white. We were very interested. We were fanatically interested in other women's lives, in things like menstruation rituals or hair. I remember there was a lot of talk about hair between black women and Jewish women who had ironed our hair as teenagers. All this stuff about women's lives was always very interracial. If you look at the literary magazine, that's why when they say, it was an upper middle class white women's movement, I say, not in my life. It wasn't. If you look at the literary magazines of the time, you've got June Jordan and many women of color and Asian women, and not that it's an ethnicity, but lesbian women, all in the same pages of the magazine, all in the same cultural movement. So it's so much like breathing to me that I don't know what to say about it.
But actually, it never was it? I mean, in the book, in the historic perspective, there are lots of women of color and Native Americans who were very active. Yeah,
that's why
feminists.
When you ask me, I say, what is there to say about it? But of course, it's like breathing.
Right.
And so it's a question of who's written the history to exit out, and where the emphasis is when we tell our own history. I mean, you can tell the story of how at a suffrage march, Ida B. Wells, who was a black crusading, anti-lynching, wonderful journalist, was pushed by some white suffrage women to the back of the march because many women in the suffrage movement were racist. You can tell that story. Or you can tell the story of how Eleanor Roosevelt invited Marian Anderson, who had been denied by the Daughters of the American Revolution a place to perform, a black opera singer. And Eleanor Roosevelt gave her the Lincoln Memorial instead. So both things are true in terms of our past, that it's been racist and anti-racist. And I've always felt like that my job was to say that, to tell both parts.
Did you see the, what was it, the Tony Awards? No, it was the Emmy Awards, when Sally Fields accepted her...
And she was bleeped?
Yes, because she said if women were running the world, right, we wouldn't have any of these.
She said if mothers were
running the world. She? All right, well, that wasn't good. But anyway, you take this interest in a community. I mean, it's not only just the scholarly thing. It's even to local your local neighborhood, don't
Right,
you?
right.
So it's large issues, it's large demonstrations, but it's also small. Are you optimistic about the world?
Oh God. What time,
We have 2 minutes.
no, I was going to say
know.
a minute ago I was, 2
Yeah.
minutes ago before
Right.
that I wasn't. About the world?
I don't know. Are you?
No,
I mean, if you
I
read
guess
the
I
paper, you've
wanna
got Hillary
sound-
Clinton with the possibility of becoming president, and you've got
I want to sound an alarm.
You've got the wife of the current president of Argentina about ready to become the president, and they like each other, and they're the same model. That's
No.
a very disappointing thing for us, isn't it?
I would sound an alarm.
Yeah.
I'm ready to sound a lot
So
of
it's
alarms.
not just being. I mean, the new level is it's not just the number of women.
No, it's what kind of women.
Thinking of it's the humanistic, feminist kind of women.
Right.
Right. We're not welcoming of women who want to think like men.
No.
Or some men. Some men think like the women. I mean, I don't mean to be exclusive that way.
Well, that brings me back to 1970 in the parking lot in Albany, when there were so many women participating in politics. They were trying to shut down abortion reform. And so it's never been important to me that they be female. In fact, we could talk about male allies, which have been there throughout history. It's what kind of women?
I think we're going to have to come back to talk again because we've talked for a half hour.
Oh, no.
Yes. Thank you very much, Louise Bernikow.
Thank you, Ronnie.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.